Well, good morning, and thanks for coming out. I appreciate it very much. It's a beautiful day out there, so the fact that you're stuck in here means that you either are really dedicated to public policy or you have no lives. So I'll prefer it's the former rather than the latter, because I was more on the latter side of this when I was in school. So you could end up a policy nerd too. I've done a few of these freedom seminars over the years, and I've always enjoyed them. They're a lot of fun, and I really appreciate it, especially the chance to interact with you folks. So I urge you, we're going to have some time for question and answer, and there's going to be some time during the break when you can talk to me. Come on, push back if you don't like something I said, and I guarantee that I will have something that will tick off every one of you at some time or another in this. So if you have something you want to push back on, something you want to talk about, something you want to expand on or ask questions about, please do. Ask questions when we have the question and answer session, and if you want to do it privately, let's do it. As you said, as you heard, there's these books up here you can pick up if you're a Northwood student, and I will happy to sign them for you or anything like that. So let's go right into this, and let's talk a little bit about poverty. And I want to start with a pretty basic question. If we're going to talk about how we deal with poverty, I think the very first question we should ask is not how do we fix poverty, but why are people poor? I mean, when you think about it, if you were a doctor and someone came in to you and said, I need to be treated, you wouldn't just start prescribing medicines for them. You'd actually want to examine them and find out what it is that's wrong with them in the first place. And too often we don't do that with public policy. Too often in public policy we have these prescribed answers. If you're on the left, it's going to be this answer, and on the right, it's going to be this answer. It's sort of like cut taxes or have a new government program. And it doesn't matter what people come in and talk about, what the problem is. Those are the two answers that we're going to have in Washington, and of course then we're not going to get anything done. So I think we ought to go right back to the beginning and ask a very basic question, that if we're going to get an answer of how to help the poor right, we need to know what it is that's actually causing poverty in this country. So let's start with that question. And let's start with a very basic question before we even can get into what is causing poverty or why are people poor, but what is poverty? I mean, that's actually sort of we know it when we see it type of thing. Well, this person's poor, we see that. But it's actually not quite that simple, and particularly not that simple if you're going to do any research on it. There's a couple of questions you have to ask. Are you talking about what's called absolute poverty? Or are you talking about what's called relative poverty? Two different ways to look at this. Absolute poverty says we have a poverty line. If you make less than $1 a day, you're poor. In this country, we actually, mostly the official poverty line is an absolute poverty measure. It is designed, actually, it's 3 times the Agriculture Department's low-cost food plan. It was designed in 1956. It hasn't been updated since, just like anything else the government does. It's sort of out of date. But it is what we officially use, and that's what you get when you hear this, $12,000 for a family of 4 or whatever it is. That's the current poverty level. It's adjusted for inflation each year. That's an absolute standard. If you're $1 above it, you're not poor. If you're $1 below it, you are poor. Very arbitrary. On the other hand, a lot of European countries use what's called a relative poverty measure. And you can even hear it sometimes in this country when they talk about the lowest 20% decile of earnings, the lowest 10% of earnings in this country, or the highest, the highest 10% or things like that. That's a relative measure. If everybody was rich, you'd still have some people who are in the lowest 10%. And by certain definitions, those people are poor in a relative sense compared to the people who are wealthy. Now you can see that there are sort of advantages and disadvantages to each of these measures. If you're using a relative poverty measure, the fact is you can never eliminate poverty. Think about it, if you doubled everybody's income, it'd be a great thing. Everybody would have more stuff. People would be less hungry. People would have better clothes, better shelter, all those sort of things. The relative poverty wouldn't have changed at all. On the other hand, if you use an absolute poverty measure, you face this sort of arbitrary cutoff. $1 over, and you're not poor. Now, come on, in your life, are you really that, any different? So both of those measures have disadvantages to them. And I can tell you the one thing everybody agrees on in Washington right now, left or right, is that the current poverty measure absolutely is terrible. But nobody has an actually better measure, which is why we go on using it. The second is, if you're going to use an absolute poverty measure, what should it be? How do you determine what that cutoff line is? Should it be the bare minimum? You know, if people have enough food or shelter, if they can buy the basic necessities of life, is that sufficient? Or do we want them to have more? You know, there's a lot of people who argue, say, look, there's actually almost no poverty in the U.S. Because if you compare us to, say, the South Sudan, nobody's living like that in the United States. You know, even you can go back to the 1960s when about a third of Americans didn't have running water and electricity and so on. All that sort of stuff's gone away. Very few people are living that kind of destitution where they don't have food, shelter, and so on. There's some, but very few live at that level. But is that really sufficient in a modern society? Do you need a cell phone? Do you need a computer? Do you need a television or a car or things like that? Those are all open questions when you look at this. You can go back, actually, the good question was asked this by Adam Smith, who talked about the good linen shirt. And he said, is a man who doesn't have a good linen shirt poor? Well, by some measures, no. If he's got enough to eat, he's got a place he can stay, we can't really say he's poor by that measure. On the other hand, if he doesn't have a good linen shirt, he can't really be part of society. He can't go to a restaurant, he can't go to a store, he has trouble if he goes out and applies for a job. He really is kind of set apart from the rest of the world, the rest of society, if he doesn't have that good linen shirt. So by some measures, the man without that linen shirt is poor. So the question you have to ask yourself, and I don't have an answer for this, is what do you consider poor and what do you not consider poor, at least in the material sense? And then the last thing I want to tell you, just in case, because you're going to be looking in and doing some research on this, you'll find that as you look at these poverty measures, most of them use what's called the official Census Bureau number of poverty. And that's the number that comes out every year. And if you read the papers, you see there's 17, 18% of Americans that are considered poor when they come out with that number. And that's the official Census Bureau definition. But there's a lot of problems with that definition. Number one is they don't count anything except cash income. So if you are earning only, let's say the poverty line is $12,000 and you're earning $10,000, you're poor. But what if in addition to that $10,000 you're getting food stamps, you're getting, your housing is provided by the government, you're in public housing, you're getting Medicaid, you're getting a number of other government benefits. You're actually, in terms of what you're spending, your disposable income is actually higher than that poverty level, but we're still going to consider you poor. We also aren't going to count taxes. So if you're earning just above that poverty level and you're paying taxes and it brings you down below that poverty level in terms of your disposable income, we don't consider you poor. We also only count the income you report. So if you have income that's sort of from the gray market, you're earning a few bucks on the side, you go down to the, you do a spare job, your mother, you take in a few extra kids and they pay you 20 bucks here or there to watch the kids, none of that money is recorded. And there have been studies that show that in general the poor spend about 150% of what they actually say they earn. So we know there's actually a lot of money sort of washing around in this gray economy out there somewhere that's not counted. So there are some other alternative measures. There's what's called the APM, the alternative poverty measures that the Census Bureau uses. There's a couple of other scholars who have come up with some alternative poverty measures that try to include what's called non-cash or in-kind welfare benefits, things like housing and food stamps and things like that, things that count taxes, things that take into account inflation, and they try to look at these other poverty measures. So they're not widespread. Most studies don't use them because they disagree on what should be included and what shouldn't. You get a lot of debate among scholars on this, but I just want to bring that up because if you're going to do any research on this, you're going to run into somebody saying, this is what the poverty measure is, this is what the poverty measure is, and they're going to be very different numbers, and you want to know what it is you're looking at when you're getting on that. So I'm going to leave to you what you can define sort of as poor in this, but I'm going to come up with an even very different measure of this. And this is what I use in my book. And when I talk about poverty, I'm talking about something much bigger than simply material deprivation, because we've actually done a pretty good job of dealing with that. If you look at this, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You may recognize this from psychology classes. And at the bottom of this pyramid here is physiological needs, things like food and shelter. That's where we've largely targeted our welfare efforts. And we've done a pretty good job, as I said, in dealing with this. We've talked about people who are food insecure and so on, but sort of mass malnutrition's been eliminated. Most people have a roof over their head. Yes, we have a homeless problem and so on. But by and large, we've done a pretty good job of dealing with these material needs that poor people have. If you actually take into account all the benefits that people get, relatively few people still fall into the poverty range. So we're targeting this and dealing with it pretty well. We're doing absolutely nothing higher up the pyramid. And I think you can't really say that people have escaped poverty until those people are masters of their own lives, until they are self-sufficient, able to take care of themselves and their family, until they control their own fate, control their own destiny. It's like children are not sort of self-sufficient as long as they're dependent on their parents to take care of them. And nobody who's dependent on the government to take care of them can really claim to be in total control of their lives. And ultimately, I'm not saying that we shouldn't help them or not. I'm just saying that ultimately our goal should be that they are self-actualized, that they can rise as far as their individual talents can take them, that every person can be all that they can be. We want people to rise as far as they can go, and we're not doing that. We're not targeting that with our current welfare system, and I think that that is insufficient. It may be necessary as part of a welfare system to target these bottom part of the pyramid. That may be necessary, but it is not sufficient. And the question is, can we do the same thing at the bottom while also helping people get out of poverty and rising to the top? Because until they reach that top part of that curve, I still consider them to be poor. So let's talk about now why people are poor. And what you find if you look into the academics of this and the politics, and surprisingly, or maybe not, there's very little difference between the politics of this and the academics of it. You find two important theories out there about why people are poor. And they sort of break down to theory on the left and a theory on the right, if you will. Sort of conservative idea of why people are poor and a liberal idea of why people are poor. And that's the one is the individual behavior and cultural theory of poverty. That's prevalent on the conservative side. And the structural theory of poverty, which is more on the progressive side of the debate. And you find both sort of academics lining up on both sides of this debate, and then you find, of course, politicians lining up on both sides of this debate. And I want to talk a little bit about both these theories in some depth here. On the individual behavior in the side, or what's often called the culture of poverty, you may have heard this term from conservative politicians a lot, the culture of poverty. That is largely based around an academic theory known as the success sequence. And what the success sequence says is that if you do some things, if you finish school, if you graduate high school, if you get a job, and you don't have children until after you are married, you are unlikely to be poor. Now, statistically, I can tell you there is a very strong correlation between each of these things individually and these things as a group with poverty. The fact is that if you do those three things, very few people who do all of them are actually below the poverty level. And you can also look at them individually. We know, if you drop out of high school, about half of all high school dropouts are living in poverty. On the other hand, if you go on to finish college, it's something like 4% live in poverty. And the reality is that if you actually take, that's at a snapshot in time, it includes a lot of people who just got out of college and haven't gotten a job yet. If you actually take that over any period of time, almost nobody who's graduated from college actually lives in poverty for an extended period. But if you're a high school dropout, more than half do. At some point in their lives, almost all high school dropouts will be below the poverty line. The days that existed 30, 40 years ago, when you could drop out of high school and go down to the factory and get a job that was going to support you and your family, those are gone. And those are not coming back. So we should recognize that that's a problem. Work? Well, this is sort of a duh thing. If you have a job, you're a lot less likely to be poor than if you're unemployed. Fewer than 3% of people who work full-time live below the poverty level. So even with all the argument about minimum wage jobs and they don't pay enough to live on, all that sort of thing, we should recognize that very few heads of households actually earn the minimum wage. And very few people earn the minimum wage for any extended period of time. About 70% of people who start at a minimum wage job get a raise before the end of the year if they stay in that job. So even any job at all is likely to lift you out of poverty. In fact, even part-time work reduces your rate of poverty by more than half, even working part-time. So working, obviously, is going to make a difference. And then finally, and perhaps the most controversial one around this group, is this idea of marriage and the fact of not having children outside of marriage. We know that if you have a child and you're not married, if you're a woman who has a child and is not married, you're 5 times more likely to be poor than if you don't have children or if you're married when you have children. 5 times more likely to be poor. Significant burden. And look, you can understand the reason why that would be the case, right? It's, 2 incomes, more than one. So if you're married, you have the benefit of the second income, right? If you're a single mother, you have all sorts of burdens on you that can interfere with your earnings. I mean, if the kid gets sick, you have to leave work. What's your employer think about that? You know, you have to take that time off. You have to find childcare. Does that make it harder for you to get a job in the first place? You have all sorts of additional expenses you might have. It means you're much less likely to be employed. If you're young, if you're a teenager and you get pregnant, your chances of dropping out of school are greatly increased. All these sort of things add up. Now, we should also recognize, though, that when we talk about each of these things, that correlation is not causation. I said there's a strong correlation for each of these things. But that doesn't mean that these things cause poverty. And that's where you get sort of the academic dispute. Everybody will agree that those things are true, that if you work, you're not going to, few people who work are in poverty, few people who graduate school are in poverty, few people who wait until they're married before they have children are in poverty. Everybody agrees on that. The question is cause and effect. Did having the child outside of marriage cause you to go into poverty? Or did the same characteristics that push you into poverty make it more likely that you have children outside of marriage? Are the circumstances of living in poverty going to make it less likely that you have a job? Is being poor a reason why people drop out of school? And that is much harder to determine. That sort of chicken and egg question is something we need to bear in mind and keep looking at as we look at these things. All we can do is say that there's a correlation between these things, and then we can do sort of what's called reasoning from inference. We can't prove that these things are responsible, but you can sort of look at these things, and what I just did with the births outside of marriage is say, okay, that makes sense because of X, Y, and Z, and therefore we can infer that that's the reason for it. It's sort of like circumstantial evidence in a murder case. You can sort of put this together. Can you prove with absolute certainty? No. But you can sort of do a preponderance of the evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt if that's what your standard is or whatever it is, and look at these things and come to a conclusion that these things have an influence. The left says that's the individual's theory of poverty, or this idea that there's a culture of poverty out there, that is because that people are poor because they make bad decisions in their life. That the poor do bad things, like drop out of school and don't work, and they get pregnant when they're not married. That it's basically the poor's fault. The left says, hold on, that's victim blaming. That you're taking the people who are in poverty and you're saying it's all their fault because they've done bad things or done dumb things. And therefore, that's why they're poor. And they say you have to take into account the circumstances in which people live, and you have to take into account structural factors in our society that may have an influence on why people are poor. And if not the individual, but society at large, and particularly its issues of race, gender, and economic dislocation that matter. And their case is built on some strong evidence as well. Let's look at race and our abysmal history in this country of treating African Americans and other people of color. You can go it's not, a lot of conservatives sort of act like I say, okay, that's fine, we had slavery, we had Jim Crow, but we passed these civil rights laws and now everybody's equal and we can just go on. Well, you can't really have a race that's 10 laps, and for 9 of the laps you've had somebody have to lug around a big weight, and then the last lap you throw down the weight and say, okay, it's an equal race from here on out. But you have to take into account the legacy that our mistreatment of people of color in this country has left. And I can give you some specific examples. For example, African Americans during slavery, if you want to look at the value of lost capital caused through slavery because they weren't paid wages that they would have earned if they had been voluntarily working, it's over $10 trillion of capital that doesn't exist in the African American community today because of slavery. You can almost double that because of lost income during the Jim Crow era when African Americans were deprived of jobs or lost income because of lower wages that they were given during the Jim Crow era. So you have this enormous loss of capital that occurred to the African American community over hundreds of years that doesn't exist today. And the fact is that most of us today, our income derives in a large part from inherited capital. Both physical capital passed down in terms of inheritance, and that's having the ability to pay for your college. It's inheritance in terms of a house. It's inheritance in terms of a lot of things that go on that simply does not exist in the African American community. But there's also sort of an intellectual inheritance as well. And here you have to look back to the fact that during the Jim Crow era, and of course during slavery as well, the people who were educated, African Americans who were educated, or who did well, or who were leaders in their community, were singled out to be lynched or killed in other ways. Communities, like in Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they had large African American banking center and entrepreneurship, were burned to the ground and every person in them murdered. Rosewood from Florida, other places like that where we went on and was deliberately, where preachers and teachers and engineers and doctors and lawyers who were in the African American community were singled out and killed simply for being what they were. That deprives an entire community of a legacy of culture, of growth and opportunity in education. Those things are handed down today and leaves people at a disadvantage. And then, of course, you have ongoing discrimination today. Everything from our criminal justice system to housing to employment. We know, for example, that if you take a test, if you send people 2 identical resumes, and one has an obviously African American name and one has a white name, John versus Shaquan, let's say, and the resumes are identical otherwise, we know that the white person is more likely to be called back for a job interview, for example. That discrimination goes on today. Conscious and unconscious. So we have to deal, and finally I was going to say there's also a psychological impact as well as you get sort of worn down from the constant issues of having to deal with it. Now we say, these small things get over them, and people should and can. But if you have to deal with it day after day after day, it does wear you down and make you less likely. If you see the people in your community who go to school and work hard and then get out and try to get a job or they're discriminated against, it's going to make you a little less likely to do the same, to work hard and try to get out. You just are. It's just a natural human reaction. So I think you have to take those things into account. You have to look at gender. Not quite the same thing because you don't have the same type of inheritance issues, at least directly because you can inherit from, you can have male intercessors in the line of inheritance, so it's not quite the same when it comes to capital. But intellectual capital, the fact that women couldn't perform many jobs in this country until fairly recently, that they couldn't own property 100 years ago, those things still exist. Now, a lot of what gets trotted out by the media in terms of women only earning 76 cents on the dollar for men and stuff like that, those statistics don't actually hold up very well. If you actually look at education and length of time in a job and things like that, those numbers sort of evaporate. But it is a fact that women are more likely to take time off from work to raise children and so on, because we still don't divide household chores and things like that equally. We still acculturate women that childbearing is the most important thing that they can do, and therefore that they should take the time off from work. There's still an acculturation that says that that's what women's job is taking care of children, not being in the labor force. That still goes on. Marital rape is still legal in a number of states. I think they just changed the law in Minnesota within the last month. So women can be pressured into having killed children or forced into having children even if that's not their choice. All these sort of things we need to take into account when we look at the fact that women are far more, and African Americans are far more likely to be in poverty than white men. And finally, we need to look at what sort of economic dislocation and disruption. As someone who believes deeply in the free market, I welcome economic disruption, what Schumpeter called creative destruction. The whole idea of a free market is innovation, the idea that we're going to replace old with new ideas. You have a better idea. If you can build that better mousetrap, people are going to come flocking to your door, but the people who made the old mousetrap are going to be out of work. That same disruption that keeps us growing and builds us and makes us a wealthier society means that some people, at least in the short term, are going to get left behind. Now, think of this. The automated car that everybody's working on, Google and Tesla and all these folks are these sort of automated cars. Once that is perfected, the day that is perfected, 4 million jobs go away. Truck drivers, taxi cab drivers, delivery people. Those jobs go away. Now, we're going to create new jobs, whole new industries built around the new cars? Yeah. But if you were a taxi driver, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good. You've got a problem in the short term. And, we say, okay, well, you should learn a new job. Well, great. That's, if you're 55 years old, that's a little easier said than done. We know that government programs, the job training and retraining programs are terrible. In fact, they can even leave you worse off when you have to complete the job training program than before you went in terms of hiring preferences. So you do have a problem. So there are these structural factors, but the question is, are they universal? Do they apply to everyone? Can you say, we do know there are people born in poverty who get out of poverty. There are people who are born under the most horrible circumstances. There are African Americans subject to every racial degradation there is, and yet they rise to the top. We know that, in fact, during the worst of the Jim Crow era, African Americans created insurance companies, banks, businesses, communities that were in many ways more intact and better off than some of them are today. So can you say that that the structural factors are responsible for people being in racism? Do they have an influence? You have to kind of look at all these things together. So I ask a simple question at the end of this. Which side is right? Which theory of this is correct? Is it the one on the right that it's individual behavior, individual choices? Is it the one on the left that says it's structural, it's society at large? Which of those is actually responsible for poverty? I think both are correct and neither is correct. I don't think you can strip poor people of agency and pretend that none of their choices matter. You can't say that poor people are nothing more than chaff blown by the winds of fate. They have absolutely no control or influence of their lives. They are simply battered around by societal factors that they have nothing to do with. They are helpless in the fate of larger societal factors. I think that is a very demeaning way to think of the poor. It reduces them to being nothing more than infants. And I think that's just wrong. On the other hand, I don't think you can ignore the circumstances in which people make choices and decisions. I think that economists talk about the fact that all choices are made within certain constraints. And the fact is that poor people and people of color face different sets of constraints than do wealthy white men. If you grow up in the poorest neighborhood of Detroit, let's say, and you live in an area where there are no jobs, and the school system sucks, and every time you set foot outside your door, some policeman hassles you for something, you're going to end up making very different sets of choices than if you live in Grosse Pointe. You just are. Now, we can try and change the incentives. We can try to educate people on why they should make different choices, but they're going to make different choices. So, now, does that mean you don't hold people responsible for their choices? Of course not. But we should also recognize why those choices are made. So I don't think it's a question of blaming the victim or of blaming society. I think both of them have a point. And there may actually be, and I'm going to talk in a bit, a third villain in this case that we're not talking about yet. But regardless of which of those two decision sides you come down on, regardless of whether you think society is more to blame, or whether you think individual behavior is more to blame, or whether you think it's a combination of the two, or neither one, what we're doing now just ain't working. Because what we're doing now is not enabling people to become fully in charge of their lives, escaping poverty as I define it. It is not enabling people to become masters of their fate and destiny, self-sufficient, in control of their lives. What we are doing now is not getting us there. And what we're doing now is simply throwing money at the problem. We talk about redistribution in our society. We do an enormous amount of redistribution in our society. This actually looks at it's a study actually showing net contributions to the government. Basically, it takes what you pay in taxes and then subtracts out what you get in benefits from it. And what we can see is if you're in the bottom 60% of incomes, you get back more in government benefits than you pay in taxes. If you are in the top 40%, you pay in more than you get out. And if you're in the top 20%, you pay in a lot more than you get out. So we actually do a fair amount of redistribution in our society. And the question is whether we're getting something for it. This actually looks at a couple of different poverty measures. This red line here at the bottom, that is actually federal welfare spending on an inflation-adjusted basis. And you can see that we are spending more and more money all the time on welfare at the federal level. In fact, right now we have more than 100 federal anti-poverty programs. About 70 of these provide benefits to individuals, either cash benefits like TANF, temporary assistance to needy families, or the earned income tax credit, things like that. They provide cash, or programs that provide what's called in-kind benefits, which are food stamps, housing programs, Medicaid programs like that. That don't pay the individual themselves, but pay someone to provide services for the poor individual. And then about 30 of those programs provide benefits not to individuals, but to low-income communities. There are things like the Community Development Block Grant or whatever. So I'm sort of defining it. For my purposes, I define an anti-poverty program as a program that is either means-tested, so it only goes to low-income people, or that it says in the program itself, this is an anti-poverty program. I consider that an anti-poverty program. So if you look at the spending on those, you can see that we go from spending under $100 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars back when the war on poverty started to spending over $700 billion on that today. And that's just at the federal level. We spend an additional $300 billion at the state and local level as well. So we're spending close to $1 trillion every year on anti-poverty programs. And the result, as I say, is that we've reduced material poverty. And you can see these are two different poverty levels. The green line is the official poverty rate. The yellow line here is actually supplemental poverty level, which basically the gap here shows that what you're getting here in this gap is the reduction in poverty that's taking place as a result of people getting in-kind benefits. This is the yellow line is what the poverty rate would be if people did not get benefits that they're currently receiving. So clearly we're reducing poverty by providing people with benefits. We're not mindful of that, but we're not dealing with the larger problem, social context. And we're not seeing an incremental increase. We're spending more money, but look, the poverty rates are essentially flat. So spending an extra dollar on welfare programs is not getting more people out of poverty. In fact, Americans, generally, everybody agrees that what we're doing isn't working. This is a poll that we just did at the Cato Institute. We used the YouGov pollsters, which are the same pollsters as the New York Times. So we're pretty confident in this. And we actually looked at this and we said, has the war on poverty been effective? And 77% of Americans said no. What we're doing isn't working. And in fact, it's across the board. 80%, you can see a little bit of differential thing between Republicans and Democrats. 80% of Republicans don't think it's worked, but 72% of Democrats don't think the war on poverty works. And in fact, 63% of people who are on welfare today don't think the war on poverty works. Almost 2/3 of people who are getting welfare don't think welfare works. That would suggest we're doing something wrong. And in fact, okay, so, the left will come back. People on the other side of this from debate for me will say, okay, we just need to spend more. The problem is, okay, people say it doesn't work, but that's because they know we're just underfunding all these programs. If we spent more money, it would work. So we actually asked people, we said, if we had unlimited money, if we found a magic money tree growing out behind the Treasury Department, and we could spend any amount of money it took, if AOC's magic monetary theory were really true, could we fix poverty? 72% of Americans still said no. And that still included 58% of people on welfare. 58% of people who are dependent on welfare benefits said if we spent an unlimited amount of money on poverty, we couldn't get them out of poverty. Clearly, we are doing something wrong. Maybe there's another answer. Maybe there's a better way. It's perhaps, in fact, I'm almost sure it's apocryphal. But the story is that Einstein said the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and get the same result. Well, we're doing the same thing. We face poverty and we say the answer must be to throw more money at it. Here's a poverty debate in Washington. We spend $98 billion a year on food stamps. Democrats say, let's spend 99. And the Republicans say, oh no, I'm fiscally responsible, let's spend 97. And one of those answers is going to fix poverty. Here's a clue. It's not. So what can we be doing instead? After the break, I'll try and tell you. Thank you very much. Appreciate you listening to me. I guess I have time for some questions. Anybody? Yeah.
At what point does the marshal benefit from increasing, government expenditures on programs like this benefit? Is there a certain point where it just kind of ceases to exist? Spending more money?
Yeah, there's clearly a diminishing returns. To some degree, any cash gift you give to people is going to make them better off. If you go out and find somebody on the street at random, give them $1, they are better off than they were before you gave them the dollar. But at some point, the marginal benefit of that begins to decline, and you have to weigh that against the sort of downside of it. The fact that that dollar means that you're not going to buy something or you're not going to be able to invest in something is going to lower economic growth. Maybe that person's going to have a tougher time finding a job, that sort of thing. Maybe you're creating a set of incentives that's going to make it harder for them. If you say, now if you get a job, I'll take away that dollar, which is what our current welfare system does, sort of gets the incentives that way. The highest marginal tax rate, incidentally, that anyone in the world faces is someone who leaves welfare and takes a job. Think about that. We worry all about marginal tax rates on the rich. If you leave welfare and you take a job, you start paying taxes on the first dollar you earn, payroll taxes on $1. You start losing your benefits almost immediately. So you get $1 of income and you lose 50 cents in benefits. And you have to take into account, suddenly you have the expenses of going to work, childcare, clothing, transportation, all those sorts of things. You can actually end up worse off under the current system if you take that job than if you stay on welfare, at least in the short term. Long term, we know you'd be much better off if you take the job. But short term, you're going to do that. And then we wonder why people are in that decision. So at some point, yeah, can I calculate to the penny what that point is? No, I haven't a clue. You're asking, a million questions on human behavior that no one that I know of is capable of doing. But we do know that overall that sort of incentive exists. That sort of problem exists. Yeah.
Before you said that working, even if it's a minimum wage job, could help get someone out of poverty.
Yeah.
And I wrote it down. I wanted to ask, in poverty-stricken communities, crime rates are higher, and people have felonies.
Yeah.
On their records, and when you compare the
Huge problem.
or compared to Midland.
Yep.
Now, people with felonies that can be granted government housing or receive government funds, and it's on their
Yep.
record and try to get that job. So how do we help those?
Save it for the second. I don't want to dodge your question, but the second half I talk extensively about that. That's one of my big. It is a huge issue. In fact, there's scholars out of Vanderbilt University suggest that if we reform the criminal justice system, that alone would reduce the poverty rate by 20%. Yeah.
You talked about some of the racial issues that we've had over the years.
Yeah.
Progressively gotten better, hopefully, but
Yeah.
you said that we can't, still, because of the inherent issues that we've caused, we can't really brush it under the rug. So,
Yeah.
is there a point where you'd say, or a solution where we can finally say that we, for the most part, solved it, or?
Yeah. We'll solve it. We'll know it when we see it.
Yeah.
But I'm generally against most government interventions because I think that they perpetuate problems and make them worse. But I also don't think you can ignore it. I think on the left, the left sort of pounds on these things in ways that everything is racist and so on, and that's alienates a lot of Middle America that way. But I think on the right they sort of pretend it doesn't exist, and it does. And the fact is, we make fun of the idea of privilege, but privilege exists. I've had things in my life, and I come from a working class background and all those sort of things, and it doesn't mean that what I worked for I didn't obtain or get through on my own. But the fact is that if you took an African American and put them in exactly the same circumstance as I am, they would face barriers that I never had to face. If I could go out every day, I walk outside my house, get in my car, drive into work, and I never once think about what's going to happen if a cop pulls me over. An African American living in my neighborhood has to, every day. That's the difference that makes, and that has an impact. And we can't just ignore the fact that that exists. So yeah, privilege exists. Does that mean, that nobody's earned anything and all? No. And does that mean that we need to, take away, from person A and give to person B? No. But it does mean you can't ignore the circumstances in which people are living and have to take that into account. Social justice and limited government are not enemies of each other. They can be complementary, and in the second half, I'm going to talk about why. All right, so the question was asked, actually, just before the break or during the break, that what do I suggest we do to fix all this? And my answer is not surprisingly, my book, right? It's the inclusive economy, bringing wealth to America's poor. It is the way to the opposite of poverty is prosperity. We spend far too much time talking about poverty and not enough talking about prosperity. I want to make poor people prosperous. And to do that, we need to include them in the economy. So how can we make a more inclusive economy, one that enables people who are poor now to gain the advantages of being part of economic growth? Well, let's start right off with one we had a question just before we began here and talk about criminal justice reform. Now, people often think, well, what's this got to do with poverty? Well, it has a lot, actually, to do with poverty. You know, as the questioner asked, if you have a criminal record, it makes it very hard for you to participate in a growing economy. You can't get a job if you go in and you have to check that little box that says you have a felony. Because maybe 20 years before you got picked up with some pot, and now you have a felony conviction, and you go in to apply for a job, and you check that little box that says you have a felony, and you're never even going to get into the interview. But it's not just that you can't get a job. In many cases, your landlord can ask on this questionnaire whether or not you've got a felony. You might not be able to get an apartment. You might not be able to get educational grants and scholarships in order to go to school. You might not be able to get licensed to get a job. In the state of Ohio, in their prisons, they have a program that they spend millions of dollars on to teach prisoners to become a barber, to teach how to be a better, it's like a barber's college in prison. Except that in the state of Ohio, if you have a felony conviction, you cannot get a barber's license when you get out. Typical government, I think, at that. But, and this impacts people in all sorts of ways, the criminal justice system. Let me give you just one example. We talked at the beginning that on the conservative side, they talk a lot about the problem of women who have children outside of marriage. And they point out that in certain inner city communities and communities of color, the out-of-wedlock birth rate is huge, very high, the out-of-marriage birth rate. And they suggest that that leads to poverty, and as I said earlier, there's a strong correlation there. So the answer on the right is women should wait until they get married before they have children. To which I ask, who the heck are they supposed to marry? It's not like in these communities there's this giant pool of computer programmers waiting around to marry them. As William Julius Wilson of Harvard has pointed out, the criminal justice system has taken 1.5 million young black men out of the marriage pool because it's taken them out of the job market and made it impossible for them to support a family because they are either in jail, on probation, or have a criminal record. So the lack of our criminal justice system is actually contributing to the increase in births outside of marriage and therefore increasing poverty. It is breaking up families. We know that intact families do better than families that are broken up, but if the man goes to jail, it often leaves no base of support for the mother. It breaks up the family, makes it hard for them to keep the family intact, and so on, contributes in that way. It contributes to unemployment. It creates a host of these problems. In fact, in our poll, well, let me go this way first. In our poll, we asked, has a criminal record ever been a barrier to your finding a job? Has your past criminal record prevented you from getting a job? And what we found was that overall it's only about 7% of people have that problem. But look, if you're on welfare today or you're unemployed, it's over 20%, 23, 22% of people who are unemployed or on welfare say that they have been prevented from getting a job because they have a criminal record. 15% of African Americans, 6% among whites and Hispanics. So it tells us a little something about the slants in the criminal justice system as well there. The U.S. incarcerates more people than any country in the world except for the Seychelles on a per capita basis. We put more people in jail than Russia and China or Iran or any of these other countries that we always condemn for their human rights violations. We put more people in jail. I mean, just look at the number of people who are in the criminal justice system, in prison, jail, probation, and parole. It's about over 6 million Americans in the criminal justice system today. And we know that the criminal justice system is biased against people of color and against people of low income status at every stage of the equation. We can start with the simple fact that we over-criminalize everything in our society. Far too many things are illegal that simply shouldn't be illegal, and that leads to all the problems with the criminal justice system. I mean, we could talk about the war on drugs and the fact that we arrest people for drug offenses more than any other thing in the United States. More people, in fact, are arrested for marijuana than for any other crime in the United States. We could talk about the war on sex work, which is the equivalent of the war on drugs for men, young men, it is for young women, and the way that that's used particularly in communities of color and to criminalize young women. Or we could simply talk about the fact that Eric Garner in New York was killed by the police for the crime of selling an untaxed cigarette. The fact is that far too much is illegal in this country, and the fact that it's illegal leads to a host of other problems. But we know that beyond that, the bias in our criminal justice system extends to every area of the criminal justice system, starting with the way the police interact with people on the street. We know that they're going to interact with a whole different attitude in communities of color than they are in wealthier suburbs. Great study by Roland Fryer out of Harvard, who actually, the top line of that, he disputes the fact, he says it's not actually true that white police officers shoot African Americans disproportionately. They shoot everybody, it turns out, disproportionately. But there's actually there doesn't appear any statistical bias in who they're shooting based on race. But in every other type of interaction that's a problem, race is a factor in terms of how they speak to the person on the street, in terms of whether they handcuff the person on the street, depends on whether they rough the person up on the street, depends on whether there are other types of abuses, excessive force use and all that sort of thing. Race is always a factor. In terms of who we arrest, we know that race is a factor. Now, here's going to be a surprise. When I was younger, some of my friends smoked pot. And police sometimes came along while we were sitting out there on the curbside, and they noticed that people were smoking pot, and they said, "Throw it away and go home." Now, do you think that that was going to be exactly the way I'd be treated or my friends would be treated if they were African American in a low-income community in a city someplace, rather than out in the suburbs? We know, statistics show, that African Americans and white use drugs at the same rate. They have the same drug usage rates for almost every type of drug, and similar rates for sale, for who's selling. And we know that African Americans are arrested at almost double the rate of whites, despite this fact. Now, I will caution there are some confounding factors in there. The fact is that in African American communities, there's often especially poor communities, there's a lack of air conditioning, which means people are more likely to be sitting out in the steppe at night doing their drugs than inside, as in the suburbs. African American communities are more heavily policed because of other crime and so on that can increase these factors. But the fact is they're more likely to be arrested. Once they're arrested, they're more likely to be sentenced to longer stretches in prison for the same crime. Some of that is statutory. The fact that up until recently, crack cocaine and powder cocaine were so different, we actually just made some corrections to that, which is excellent. The First Step Act even made it retroactive, terrific criminal justice reform. But the fact is that even when it's not statutory, you get biases within the sentencing system. Plea bargaining, you're more likely to plea bargain as white defendants, more likely to plea bargain than African American defendants. Once you get people in prison, how we treat them in the prison system and whether we teach them skills that are going to enable them to get out, of course, is a failure, needs to be reformed. And then, of course, you have this problem with the criminal record that I mentioned earlier. The fact that if you have a criminal record, it's a huge problem. Now, how we fix this problem is going to be more complex because one of the answers, which I actually still support, it's called ban the box, which simply says employers cannot, except for certain types of jobs. Obviously, you're looking for a bank guard, you can ask whether the person's been arrested for robbery and things like that. But for most part, you can't ask whether people just have a blanket have you have a felony conviction or anything. I think that's actually pretty good. However, there are some studies now that show that people basically, that if you ban the box, some employers will simply use race as a proxy for a criminal record. They'll say, oh, won't hire any young black men because we just assume they all have a criminal record. So we have to watch out whether that takes place or not. But as of right now, the evidence is inclusive enough to change my mind. I still support ban the box, but it's something that we should be looking at. As I mentioned earlier, scholars at Vanderbilt University have looked at this, and they suggest that if we reform the criminal justice system from top to bottom, from overcriminalization to how we treat people on the street, getting rid of the bias and how we treat police treat people, to how we deal with sentencing, to how we treat people after they get out of prison, that we could reduce the poverty rate by 20% through that fact alone. Through simply that one measure would have the most significance in terms of reducing poverty of anything that we could do. And I know you got a panel coming up or a speaker coming up on criminal justice reform later on. I hope you'll take that into account. Second, education. Here's another dull moment. Getting an education is a route out of poverty. As I mentioned earlier, we talked about this. If you drop out of school, you're going to be poor. If you go on to college, you're not. But we know that school systems are failing people, particularly in poor communities and communities of color. Our public school system is a dismal failure in terms of preparing them for college. And it's not a question of money. This looks at, this top line here is spending on American public schools since 1970. You can see that the spending has been rising steadily. This line here is the number of employees in the school system. This is nationwide. That's been rising steadily. These are scores, education test scores. Now, I don't think, not one of these things think education test scores measure everything. But the fact that they have been totally flat, despite the increase in spending, suggests that maybe more money isn't going to be the answer to fixing the problem. And in fact, we know that some of the school systems are the worst in the nation. Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Chicago, L.A., Detroit, some of the worst school systems in the nation spend more per student than anywhere else in the country. Money isn't necessarily the answer. The problem is that the current school system has no competition, no innovation, that basically we teach today exactly the same way we taught 100 years ago, except now instead of a chalkboard, you have a computer screen. We don't do things different. We don't innovate. And you don't innovate when you have a monopoly. Think about any monopoly anywhere, and what does, it produces low quality at high price if you don't have competition in the system. And if consumers have no option, if you live in a bad school area, what choice do you have, really? And in fact, in some states, it is a crime to send your child to a better school district than the one you're assigned to. In the state of New Jersey, there are people serving jail time because it's a 5-year sentence for having sent your child to a school system outside of your assigned district. You can't go to a private school unless you can afford it. Poor people can't. Wealthy people can. Religious school, whatever it might be. You're stuck with a lousy school. We need to have more competition, more choice, more innovation in our school systems. And that means that we need to protect parents and children, not necessarily administrators and the school system. Systems aren't the problem, aren't what's important, people are. So we should allow more competition, and there's a variety of ways to do that, whether it's charter schools or vouchers, or tuition tax credits, or simply reforming the existing system. There's a variety of methods in this. In the book, I talk about different ones at length. But what we need to do is challenge the status quo when it comes to the school system and do things differently. We actually asked, an interesting question, we asked people, and we use the term voucher in here because it's the most pejorative term we could think of. It's the one that actually generally has the most negative response. And we asked people whether or not they favored a system in which people got a voucher to go to the school of their choice. And what we found was, not surprisingly, Republicans like it. Democrats generally do not. Big ideological split on this. This is probably the area we found the biggest ideological split of all. Welfare recipients. 2/3 of them said they would prefer a voucher system. Why? Because by and large they know the school system in their neighborhood is terrible and they want to go someplace else. Now, I will caution you on these numbers, these other favorable numbers, the Democrats and Republicans, or the particularly Republican numbers. The Republican numbers go down very quickly as soon as they think it means children of color moving to their neighborhood. Suburban legislators think of school choice as being something that's going to take place in the city, not something that's going to mean actually black children and sitting next to their kids. But so those numbers do tend to go down when you start pushing on them. But I find it interesting, particularly that welfare recipients in particular tend to be more open to school choice. Number 3, housing deregulation. This one surprised me as I was doing the research on the book. What's particularly interesting here is that low-income people suffer 2 ways when it comes to cost of housing. One is housing is just expensive for them. On average, poor people spend 40% of their income on rent or housing costs, which is a lot of money if you don't have a lot of money. So you have simply a direct cost impact on them. But second, if you can't afford higher rents, you can't move. You can't move to a neighborhood that might have jobs. You can't move to a neighborhood that has lower crime rates. Or you can't move to a neighborhood that has better schools. You're ghettoized. You're trapped in this area with nothing but other low-income people and poor services and poor schools and few jobs. You're trapped there because you can't afford the rent in a better neighborhood. Now, some of them say, okay, well, rents are going to be higher in better neighborhoods and so on, and you're going to have the market forces at play here, and that's true. But the fact is that government policy often drives up these costs. We asked an interesting question here before I go into that. We said, has expensive housing prevented you from ever moving to a better location that would improve your lifestyle, improve your living? It turns out it's a problem for pretty much everybody. But if you earn more than about $60,000 a year, the majority said no, they were able to move. If you were poor, it became a real problem. 78% of people on welfare said they couldn't move because it was just too expensive. Again, if this is all due to markets, there's not much we can do about it. Subsidies maybe, something like that. But the problem is, in many cases, government policies that drive up the cost of housing. In particular, zoning and land use laws. Zoning laws are some of the worst offenders in this. In fact, there are studies out there that show that in some cities, like New York and San Francisco, zoning adds 50% to the cost of housing. And zoning, particularly, it's interesting, because zoning laws started with a racial purpose. If you look at zoning laws, the very first zoning law was in Los Angeles, but the second zoning law in America was in Baltimore. And that zoning law specifically forbade anyone from renting or selling to a person of a different race than the majority race on that street. So if 51% of the street was white, you could not sell to a black family or rent to a black family in that street. That was part of the zoning ordinance of Baltimore, done around 1890, 1900. And it was copied then in Richmond, Virginia after that, and then Birmingham, Alabama, and then it spread throughout the Jim Crow South and other places. It still today has the same segregatory effect as it did back then, because zoning now is not race-based, it's income-based, and basically zoning laws are designed to keep poor people out of your neighborhood. Not in my backyard, NIMBY. You'll hear that phrase a lot. We looked, this is a study by the Cato Institute by my colleague Vanessa Calder, who basically looked at the strength and frequency of zoning and land use regulations in the states and compared that with the cost of housing and found a very strong correlation between those states that had the strongest zoning laws and the increased cost of housing in the nation, or in those states. And we're not talking, I want to clarify something here, because when I talk about this before, people often talk about here zoning, and they say, look, I got a house, I don't want anyone building a hog farm next to my house. That's not generally the type of zoning laws I'm referring to here. But for example, in San Francisco, there's a requirement that says for every apartment you build, you have to have 1.5 parking spaces. We zone for single-family houses and we forbid high-density housing, even though that's better for the environment, even though it's better for poor people and so on. Or we prohibit luxury housing or unless people build so many low-income houses and so on. We do a host of things designed to prevent housing from being built. And housing costs are a function of supply and demand. If there's so many people want houses and only this many houses available, it's going to drive up the cost. If you prevent people from building more houses, you're going to keep the cost high. I feel sorry for, people say, well, I don't want to spoil my view. I don't want to, the aesthetics of it. I don't want, poor people in my neighborhood. They'll go to my schools. There'll be all this problem if they move to my neighborhood. I don't want apartment complexes built. Talk about your definitions of privilege. I'm going to use the government to prevent people from moving to my neighborhood because I want to protect my aesthetics or my property values. Seems remarkably unfair to me. I weep. There was a story in the New York Times, about 3 months ago, talking about the problem of people who had bought a $2 million apartment and they'd had a view of the river, and someone built another building that blocked their view of the river, and they had to sell their apartment, and they barely were able to sell it for $2.5 million. I feel for them. I'm sorry. Much more important that some poor people be able to get housing than that we keep their apartments selling for a profit. Because you don't own someone else's property that they want to build on. And using the power of government to interfere with their property rights to build and do with on their property as they see fit seems remarkably unfair. And to do it on a discriminatory basis, often racial, often class-based, seems remarkably unfair. If you want to help poor people, we need to have housing costs come down. Fourth, we need to make savings easier. We are remarkably biased against savings in this country. We're pro-consumption, anti-saving. And we do that with the poor people in a couple of different ways. Number one, on one side of it, we simply make it hard for poor people to open a bank account. We're so obsessed with the war on drugs and the war on terrorism, whatever, that we've identified all these, you have to have all these identification things that the government provides, driver's license and all this in order to open a bank account. About 20% of poor people don't have the proper documentation to open a savings account. We worry a lot, you hear a lot of debate about voting IDs and things like that. What about the fact that you can't open a bank account without an ID? And if you don't have a bank account, think what that means. It's so much harder to save, you can't borrow, you can't use it as collateral. How do you cash a check? You have to go to a check cashing place that charges a huge fee to do that. Then you have to walk around with a wad of money in your pocket because you can't put it anywhere else. And if you're carrying around a wad of money in your pocket, well, you're going to get robbed. Or if you don't get robbed, the police think you're a drug courier because you got $500 in your pocket and they just take it under asset forfeiture. So yeah, we make it hard for poor people to save money. And then our welfare programs are biased against savings. Our welfare programs think it's fine to spend, but bad to save. And yet, you don't spend your way out of poverty. But if you get a welfare check, get your TANF check, and you go down and buy a new pair of sneakers or basketball shoes with it, that's cool. We're fine with that. Spend every penny you got. Check will come next week. However, if you take any of that money away and you put it in a 529 account for your kids to go to school someday, we're going to take away your check. Because now you have assets. And we don't want you to have any. You don't qualify for welfare benefits anymore if you have assets. Now, obviously, there's going to be an asset test. You don't want last year's lottery winner, collecting welfare because they don't have, because they have no income, they just have an asset stream or something. But we count the weirdest things. If you have a car, so that you might be able to go out and get a job to get off of welfare, we say that's an asset, and therefore you can't get any welfare benefits. Our whole system is set up backwards. We should be encouraging savings and investment, discouraging overconsumption. We just seem to have this bias in this country. We tax savings. We don't tax consumption by and large. The whole thing seems to be backwards. And then lastly, and most important of all, and this was the whole thing behind my book, we need inclusive economic growth. Look, fact of life here. Nothing brings more people out of poverty than economic growth. No government program comes close to bringing as many people out of poverty as does a growing economy. In fact, Deidre McCluskey, famous economist, calls it the great fact that for most of human history, you can go back, way back in human history, most of mankind was desperately, terribly poor, struggling to survive. And over that massive history, mankind was this small elite that was slightly less desperately struggling poor. We were poor everywhere. In fact, even 100 years ago, you look at very few poor people today would actually change their lifestyles for the wealthy person of 100 years ago. I mean, think about it, what you didn't have back then. The Carnegies, they had a great big house that couldn't be heated. Didn't have electricity. Things like that. But anyway, you go through human history, and what you see is that people are poor, 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 and then all of a sudden, there's a giant leap in the wealth of mankind. And what caused that is essentially it's the advent of modern free market capitalism. Free markets, the ability to exchange, innovation, entrepreneurship, investment, risk-taking, all that goes with modern capitalism, that lifted people out of poverty. And we know, we actually asked again, what does more to fight poverty? More spending on welfare or economic growth? Public says 70% of the public says we need economic growth, not more welfare spending. People on welfare were even more likely to say economic growth. 3 out of 4 people on welfare said, hey, put that money into creating economic growth, create some jobs in my community. Let's not spend more money on welfare, let's spend more money on economic growth. And we know how to get there. We know what grows an economy. This is the Prosperity and Freedom Index. This one's from 2014. There's actually been a couple of updates since then, but they say the same thing. This is basically the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Index. This is put together every year by the Fraser Institute in Canada, along with about 120 think tanks from around the world that grade every country in the world on its economic liberty. This is the GDP per capita. And what you see is it's clear that the more free your economy is, the stronger your economic growth, the wealthier your people are. We know that deregulation, lower taxes, more free trade, more exchange, more ability for people to do what they need to do in the economy leads to more economic growth, and that can lead to more people getting out of poverty. But only if that growth is inclusive. It doesn't do the same good if all that growth simply accrues at the top. We have to let the people at the bottom get in on that growth. That doesn't mean we need to stop the growth at the top. You don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. You don't want to say we're just going to take money from the people, the growth at the top, and give it to people at the bottom, because then you don't get any growth. You can't redistribute something that doesn't exist. If you simply tax the people at the top and they stop investing, stop doing entrepreneurship, they stop risk-taking, you're not going to get that growth to begin with. You're not going to be able to have any money for people at the bottom. So instead of trying to tear down the people at the top, what we want to do is take the people at the bottom and get them in to the economy. Some of that we talked about already. Some of that is criminal justice reform and education reform and savings incentives and housing reform. Those things will all help get people into the economy. But there's some specific barriers that we need to look at. We need to look at things like occupational licensing laws. Do you realize that about between 25 and 30% of all the jobs in this country require you to get permission from the government before you practice your profession? And I'm not talking about doctors and lawyers. We can argue about whether doctors should be licensed and so on. I'm talking about things like florists, hair cutters, hair braiders, cosmetologists, funeral directors, interior designers, job after job after job that requires you to get permission, expensive permission from the government in order to practice your profession. Let me give you an example. The state of Louisiana, single mother there, wants to get off of welfare. She's got a skill in arranging flowers and flower displays. She's got design skill, just got an innate sense of how to do those sorts of things. So she wants to become a florist. She has to take a class that lasts several months. She has to pay for the class. She has to go to it every couple of days during the week, which means she has to find childcare while she does that. She has to buy the course materials. After she finishes the course, she has to take a test to become a florist, because God forbid we be exposed to bad floral arrangements. That test is only given twice a year, and only in Monroe, Louisiana. And it's a 2-day test. So she has to actually find transportation to Monroe and a hotel and child care, and she has to pay to take the test. How is that supposed to get her off of welfare, get her a job, and get her to take care of herself, be self-sufficient, and to become a fully actualized person in charge of her own life? It's not going to. And the same is true with job after job after job. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a criminal record, you can't become a florist. Because if you smoke pot when you're 20, there's no way you could actually put flowers in a vase when you're 35, right? You know, these special interest lobbies that protect these things, it's amazing. We fought the interior designers in Florida and lost. They have a licensing requirement. You can't be an interior designer. You know, if you picked out the wrong colors, throws, people might die. They actually said that. I mean, not the color, but they actually said if we did away with licensing of interior designers, people in Florida would die. And the explanation was something like, if you were designing a senior citizen's home and people put inferior, non-tested inferior designers, non-licensed interior designers, put in flammable curtains, then they could start a fire and people would die when the senior citizen center burned down. So that's essentially what you're up against on that. Occupational zoning, same thing. that mother in Louisiana then, she finally gets her license. She says, okay, I'm going to start putting together some floral arrangements in my kitchen, and is immediately shut down because that's not zoned for being able to do home business. Occupational zoning, the idea that Steve Jobs, in his, or was it in his garage putting together the first computer, oh, no, we can't do that anymore. Not zoned for that. Child care. Obviously, if you're a woman and you have trying to get a job, child care is a huge problem, right? But we make child care ever more expensive through our regulations. In Washington, D.C., they have just passed a law which says that everybody who provides child care in the city must have a bachelor's degree. You don't have to have a bachelor's degree to have a child, but apparently you have to have one if you're going to take care of a kid. And what does that do? It drives all the church-based, all the informal arrangements, all the grandmas taking care of a few neighborhood kids. They're out of business. And only the licensed professional daycare centers that paid a lot of money to the D.C. City Council, they're still in business and they charge a whole bunch of money for their child care services. So a lot of poor people can't afford it and simply are not going to be able to get jobs in the future. And finally, I have to look at the minimum wage laws. Minimum wage basically is a barrier against entry-level jobs. Because we hear people can't live on minimum wage and so on, and there's something to that. But we should note that the statutory minimum, no matter what the statutory minimum wage is, no matter what we say it is, $7.25 an hour, $15 an hour, $100 an hour, you can pick any number you want and mandate that that be the minimum wage. The actual minimum wage is always zero. Because I can always choose not to hire you. And if you tell me that I have to pay you $15 an hour, you had better produce $15 worth of value added to my business. Because if you don't, I'm not going to hire you. So who do you think is not going to produce $15 value added? Someone getting their first job? Someone with very few skills? Someone who didn't finish school? Someone looking for that first start to come into a job? The higher the minimum wage, the less likely it is that they are going to get hired. You're basically squeezing people out at the end of the scale. Yeah, you're helping people who were, making $10 before, they may go up to $15, but if you were not doing any job, you're not going to get hired at that $15. More automation. You wonder why you go into a fast food restaurant now and you punch the little button instead of going up to see someone at the desk? Because of minimum wage laws. Automation is just going to be faster. Government studies from the Obama administration showed that about 40% of jobs held by low-income people were vulnerable to automation. The higher you make minimum wage, the more likely you are going to do away with those jobs. And they'll be replaced by other jobs, but not the jobs, the skills set for people who are starting out today. So you need to look at those sorts of things. This is on occupational licensure, just to go back to that one for a minute. We asked, has lack of an occupational license ever prevented you from finding work? 45% of people on welfare and 46% of people who are unemployed said yes, that their lack of a license prevented them from getting a job. 45%. Extraordinary impact of something as simple as that, blocking people from getting in on the bottom of the economic scale. We asked people a very simple question at the end. We said, what should government do to fight poverty? Should it try to eliminate poverty's causes, or should it give more money to poor people so that they can get on their feet? And what we found was that about 70% of Americans and fully 59% of people on welfare said we should prioritize the causes of poverty. We should try to deal with the problems of making people poor, not simply deal with those material problems and help make poverty less miserable, if you will. So I want to just go back to the question I asked at the beginning about who is responsible for poverty. Why are people poor? The right blames the victim, says it's the poor people themselves. The left blames society, says it's larger social factors. I think there is a third villain here, and that is the government. And government policies that push people into poverty, whether it's our criminal justice system or our education system or our housing policies or our savings programs or barriers to inclusive economic growth. Those are all government policies, things we're doing today that are making people poor. So if we want to fight poverty, if we want to deal with those causes of poverty, the very first thing we should do is stop making people poor. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time. You're going to collect questions that way.
If you are a student, could you please put your initials on your card before passing it down? If you have a question, yes. Otherwise, okay, while people are working on their questions, and we have a very short amount of time here to work on this, here's the first question. To what extent can we rely on the community, that is the independent nonprofit sector, to solve the problems of poverty as opposed to government efforts? So could you address that?
Yeah, I think we need to put more emphasis on the community. First of all, community is better able to intervene in the specific needs of individuals because they know them better. They know what people's problems are, and people's problems are often things that we don't want the government to get involved with. It has to do with their mental health, that it has to do with the way they were brought up, it has to do with problems in the family, it has to do with drug and alcohol problems. These are all things that the government doesn't do a very good job of dealing with, but private institutions do a much better job of solving. And we know that the amount of giving in society adjusted for economic growth is roughly constant. What changes is the mix between government programs and private charitable contributions. When government program spending goes up, private charitable contributions go down. When people perceive that government programs are spending less on welfare, people actually give more to the poor. So we certainly can be doing more. And look, you can't have vital communities. Charles Murray points out that you can't have vital communities if you don't give them anything to do. Now, not too long ago, when there was a problem, you went into the church and the preacher would say, I'm passing the plate to help this family's encountered a crisis in our church. I'm passing the plate, give till it hurts. Today the preacher says, write Washington, tell your congressman to to vote for this program or that program. Very different attitudes.
Okay, in Michigan, we just legalized marijuana.
Yeah.
We're one of several states to do that, and we're wondering what kind of impact do you think this might have on the criminal justice issue that you raised?
I think it'll have some impact. Certainly, we know that marijuana is the crime people are most arrested for. It will have some impact. There's still problems, of course, in how you're going to distribute it, and the federal rules that prevent and limit the people participating in the field. We do know that smuggling of marijuana from Mexico has decreased significantly, actually, since states have begun legalizing it. However, we also know that they have not, basically these formalized markets that they're creating have not been able to compete with the informal markets because of the taxes and the regulations that have created with them. So basically what they're trying to do is create a sort of government monopoly system alongside the informal market that's out there, and I'm skeptical of whether they're going to be able to really undermine the private market in terms of sales. But that said, yeah, it's certainly going to make a difference in terms of whether the cops are rousting you or not.
Okay. Here's a question. What are your thoughts on guaranteed work programs, government work programs, especially those that might be targeted towards minorities?
I think they're a terrible idea. Basically, what you're doing is setting the government up to compete with private jobs. So basically, what you're going to do is create a job which may or may not be meaningful. It often comes at an enormous expense. You look at the jobs created during the Stimulus Act, and they spent about $150,000 per job to create a job. Simply because, and many of these jobs didn't actually do anything that was actually productive or creating greater wealth in our society. We want jobs actually, simply, I'm sort of not a Keynesian, if you will, economically. Keynes said, you could have people dig a hole and then fill in the hole, and they're working and you can pay them for it, and it doesn't really matter whether they produce anything. I believe you've got to produce new wealth, new growth in society. What I want to see is entrepreneurship, people creating new ideas, new wealth, new things in society, not simply doing make work, which is what a lot of these jobs simply are. Now, you know, there's arguments about how we should do in infrastructure and things like that. I'd rather see us shift some of our current funding to infrastructure from sort of redistribution programs. Only about 13% of all federal spending is actually infrastructure programs. Almost everything else is simply taking money from John and giving it to Bill.
Here's a question about the automation.
Yeah.
Automation, and if it proceeds as quickly as some people anticipate, won't this be a race between some of the policy reforms that you're talking about and the joblessness and poverty created by technological change?
Yeah, I'm of two minds about this. One is there's an argument out there since says jobs are going away, and I don't buy it. We've heard that so many times in history. Oh my God, when everybody moves off the farm, there won't be jobs for them. Well, it turns out there was. Oh my God, we have steam engines running the looms in England now instead of people sitting there and doing it by hand. There'll be mass unemployment. Well, it turns out we were able to, to deal with that. In 1937, Franklin Roosevelt stopped funding government investment in science and research because he was afraid that if we created too many new inventions, it would actually put too many people out of work. Somehow we managed to still have new inventions and still have people employed. We hear, this idea that if what happens is certain jobs go away and we create new jobs. It's always been the case in history. I predict that that's going to happen in the future. But that doesn't mean that there's not disruption in the short term for the people who lose out. And I do think that if we don't have some of these reforms that I talked about, people are going to be on the short end of this, are going to turn Luddite. They're going to be very anti-innovation, anti-technology. We're already seeing some of that. You see, movement against automation, movement against trade, things like that from people who are left behind. We have to find ways in which they can benefit from the economic growth that the rest of us receive. They can't be left behind. And so I do think it's something of a race between the type of reforms that I'm talking about and whether or not they become so alienated that they simply oppose the things that are going to bring us economic growth.
Okay,
This Trump phenomenon.
Try to reduce that.
Yeah, but the vast majority of people now, you have to differentiate a little bit between federal prison and state and local prisons. But in state and local prisons, the majority of people in prison are not violent felons. They're actually there for drug offenses of one kind or another, or other things that shouldn't be criminalized in the first place. Look, I want to put robbers, rapists, and murderers in jail. I have no problem with that. They're letting some of them out in California because we're locking people up for third strike where they stole a pizza and things like that. I think we need to have a sense of proportion on that. The number of people actually committing violent crimes is actually fairly low.
Okay, I'm going to finish with this last question.
We're actually safer. By the way, I say we are. If you look at crime rates, we are much safer than we've been since the 1970s.
Good news. Michael, this student asked, if there's one thing that you want us to take away from your presentation today, what would that be?
It is that social justice and limited government are not enemies of each other. The politicians try to pretend that it is, that you are either woke and you're for social justice, or you're conservative and you're for limited government and freedom and free markets. They are the same thing. You can achieve socially just ends by limiting governments where it blocks justice. And government is almost never the friend of the poor. Government is almost always the friend of the people on top. Almost always it will punish the people who are minorities, people of color, poor people. We shouldn't be embracing big government to solve the problem because it's going to backfire. We should be embracing limited government, free markets. That's what's going to lift people up. That's what's going to achieve social justice. And we should be able to do the two, and we should be able to have a dialogue about it. You mentioned at the beginning earlier, this is not something where people should be on opposite sides. We should all agree with our goals on this and then have a conversation about how to get there. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.